Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to our panel titled Europe's Digital Regulations, What's the Impact on CE Region and Slovenia? The event is co-organized by the Center for European Perspective in Slovenia and the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels. My name is Jaka Repanšek, and I'm the co-chair of the Strategic Committee on Regulation and Environment at the Slovenian Digital Coalition. Europe's digital regulations are changing, and the EU is now considering the shape and restrictiveness of the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and the new AI regulation, among numerous other digital files on the table in Brussels. I actually counted almost 20 of them during the ongoing Slovenian presidency of the Council of the European Union. These regulations will have an impact on Slovenia, the wider CE region, and the EU as a whole. They will impact on the continued efforts to digitalize our society and prosper from investments in digital capacity. We will ask our panelists, what is the likely impact and how will it affect different sectors in our economy and society? I believe there are a few things all of us in the digital environment and economy agreed upon. Above all, we strongly support Europe's goal to ensure development of its digital economy, society, and digital capabilities. There is no doubt about that. But we must also encourage European startups, SMEs, and other companies to address challenges of today, such as the pandemic, lack of digital competences, and the lack of resilience in our supply chains. We must maintain cross-border data and technology sharing in order to be globally competitive. Our industrial players must have all the tools to assert their position and to promote open markets, European values, and international standards reflecting those very values. Only by promoting a clear, united, competitive, collaborative, and transparent European regulation and overall position in the global digital arena shall we have the potential to strengthen Slovenian, regional, and European digital society and industry, not only during the next digital decade, but for the decades to come. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Mr. Fredrik Eriksson is the director of the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels, and he will briefly present a new report analyzing the impact of new digital regulation on CE countries, including Slovenia. The presentation will be followed by a discussion with Mr. Eriksson and the distinguished panelists from the industry, business sector, and government of Slovenia. Mrs. Alina Dimovte is the EU Policy and Political Campaigns Manager at Google. Dr. Til Rozman is the Secretary at the Government Office for Digital Transformation of the Republic of Slovenia. And Mr. Igor Zorko is the President of the Management Board of Slovenian Digital Coalition and the Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce of Slovenia. Welcome everyone and thank you for being with us today. Mr. Eriksson, let us start with a brief presentation of your report. The stage is yours, please.
Well, thank you very much, Jaka, and also not just thank you to you, but also thank you to Katja, Tina, and others that have been collaborating with us with this event as well. We're very grateful that you are partnering with us to have a discussion about these matters. We are now on to, I think, our third collaborative event, so looking forward to more in the future. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time sort of walking through a lot of data and a lot of statistics concerning the report that Jaka just mentioned, which is that we have been looking at these three different proposals that are now sort of going through the machinery in Brussels and the member states, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Artificial Intelligence Regulation. And we started this because we became a bit curious when we looked at the impact assessments that came with these proposals. Some of these impact assessments were a bit, to put it generously, light on economic aspects. For instance, when the Commission goes through the AI regulation proposal, it comes up with an argument that this is going to add substantial economic benefits to the EU. And that may be true. But when you look at the vehicle for that to be achieved, it basically comes through an increased trust in users in AI applications. And I think that may be correct to say that sort of there is a strong correlation between businesses and consumers trusting AI solutions and their propensity to to adopt them and to use them. I mean, that's for sure. But it's impossible to put any certain weight on it and trying to figure out what the economic consequences are going to be. But that was basically the only thing that came up in the impact assessment when it comes to economic analysis. A few things on compliance costs for individual firms, but not sort of going deeper into economy, trying to figure out. So when you put restrictions like you do in a regulation like this into the economy, what are going to be the different effects that are going to emerge depending on what your economy looked like? So that was the first point. The other point was that the underlying assumption was that all countries in the EU was going to react basically in the same fashion to the introduction of these new regulations. There is no big difference between, you know, a country like Slovenia or a country like Sweden. There is no difference between Poland and Portugal. They are both economies are going to react almost identically to the introduction of these regulations. And if there's something we know from a lot of regulations in the past in the economy, and also from digital regulations that we have adopted over the past 10, 15 years, it is that there's a strong variation between countries in how they react to these regulations, depending on lots of different factors. Most importantly, what type of industry do you have? I mean, do you produce a lot of the things that you're going to regulate? Do you import them, etc.? So what we wanted to do was to take a deeper look into this issue, trying to figure out not just variations on countries, but also variations between sectors. I mean, when you put a regulation into the economy, it may, the most interesting fact or the most interesting observation may not be that, you know, the economy as a whole in the aggregate is going to lose or win X billions or X percent or something. The more interesting thing may be that you look at how different sectors are going to react to each other. So when you put, for instance, DMA, you come with most likely restrictions on the use of different data for gatekeeper platforms. What will that do, not just to this sector, but to other sectors as well? And then, of course, we have variation between firms. Even if you are a firm in the same sector in the same country, doesn't mean that you're going to react identically to the introduction of regulation. The firm responses can vary a lot. And one of the defining factors behind how firms behave is, of course, how big are you? Do you have a size advantage as a firm? Do you have enough in-house capacity to perhaps substitute data that you take from an external supplier with data that you can generate on your own? That's a pretty big, important substitution effect if you come with a restriction that is going to make it more costly and more difficult to use data from others, for instance. So that's what we've been trying to do. We've looked at 3 different country groups, countries in the north, the CE countries, and continental European economies. We have, of course, for all these groups, gone into individual results also for countries in these groups. And the overall conclusion that we arrived to is that when it comes to both DMA and DSA, countries in the north and CE countries are going to be more badly affected than continental European economies are going to do for a variety of reasons. But when it comes to the AI regulation, it's actually continental European economies, and especially Germany, that are going to be most badly affected by it, followed by northern countries and CE countries. Mm-hmm. Now, let me just sort of walk through very quickly a couple of points of what's behind these different results. Well, a first result when it comes to the CE group is that the digital intensity in the economy, how much you use digital technologies and digital services, is much lower in the CE countries than it is in both other country groups. Most CE countries are pretty substantially below the EU average when it comes to issues like how much do you use big data analytics, how much do you use AI, how much do you use cloud computing services in the economy. For the CEE group as a whole, one interesting outcome is that when it comes to the intensity of use of Internet of Things application, it's actually higher in the CE than it is in the EU as a whole. Then there are a couple of interesting variations inside the CE group. Slovenia is one of them. For instance, when it comes to the use of cloud computing services, Slovenia is above the EU average, and it has a higher intensity in different sectors in its economy when it comes to using cloud computing services. When it comes to data supply, your sort of an economy's ability to generate its own data that you use in order to run digital services, develop digital services, all CE countries are below the EU average, both in terms of volume and the number of data suppliers in the economy. And what we can see pretty clearly from our analysis is that sort of this lower digital intensity in the economy has an effect on productivity of sectors that are highly dependent on digital inputs. So when you look at retail, or if you look at information communication sectors, finance, you see there is a clear relationship between the more intense you use different digital technologies and services, the higher productivity is going to be. So this is one of the factors that leads to the results for the CE group generally. And that was my first point, low digital intensity in the economy. The other point, and the second point, which is equally important, which is that there are very few countries and companies inside the CE group that have a size advantage. And a size advantage basically means that you're big enough in order to generate in nominal terms so much data or so much demand that you need in order to supply sectoral growth, which is going to make you competitive. This is true also for the Nordic countries. I mean, apart from a few countries like Sweden, to some extent Finland, all the other Nordic countries, they don't have any size advantage either. The size advantage for a country like Sweden isn't that it's a sort of very populous country, is that compared to the rest of the EU, it has so many data suppliers that generate so much data into the economy that even on a nominal term, not a per capita term, but a nominal term, Sweden belongs to one of the most important data suppliers in the EU. But no country in the CE has that type of advantage. Firms in the CE region generally tend to be smaller when you go into sectors that are highly dependent on digital technologies and services, which is partly explained by a high turnover, a huge wave of firm exits and new firm entry during the 1990s after the collapse of communism and sort of the birth of new independent countries in the CE region. No other countries in the EU have gone through a similar type of creative destructions on the firm level, which basically means that you don't have a lot of big companies with incumbency advantages that they're big and strong just because they were big and strong in the 1950s. I mean, there are of course that type of companies as well, but generally for the CE region itself, there is a lot of entrepreneurship and a lot of small firms, and that's the point. You have a lot of small firms. These firms are growing fast. Small firm growth, or firm growth generally in the CE region, is much higher than it is in continental Europe. It is not as high as it is in northern part of Europe, but it's high. And this is one of the strong comparative advantages for all CE countries, which is that you have a lot of dynamic entrepreneurship with startups and small firms that are growing pretty fast. A final point, which is on policy, and this may come as a surprise, but CEE countries generally have a lot higher restrictions, policy restrictions on the digital economy than both the two other groups, Northern countries and continental European economies. These restrictions come partly sort of in network infrastructure and connectivity, but there are also restrictions that come on the business side and business regulations, where it's more difficult to do digital business in the CE countries compared with the other two country groups. Here again, there are a couple of countries that stand out in the other direction. So especially Croatia has a much lower restrictiveness for its digital regulation. It's much more open compared to the rest of the CEE. Slovenia is pretty much about the average for the CEE group itself. But this basically comes to the point where you have already pretty significant restrictiveness in your policy. And when you add additional restrictions from DMA, DSA, AI, etc., you're going to find that the effect of these restrictiveness are going to have a stronger impact on your economy than it has on other economies where the level of restrictiveness was lower in the beginning. So these are three factors. There are a lot of many other factors that we cover in our study. We have a chapter in a book done by Center for European Perspectives that are coming out pretty soon, ahead of the 3Cs initiative, I believe, where we walk through some of the specific results for the CE group as well. But we have lots of more for individual CE countries as well, and I'd be happy to share more of them during the conversation. Thank you.
Fredrik, thank you so very much for your introduction and all the information. So when will your report be broadly available to the public? When do you expect that to happen?
So the full report is coming out before the end of the month. Okay,
perfect. Fredrik, I'm just going to continue with just one quick question or a comment with you, and then I'm going to go to Alina. I've just been in contact with Slovenian permanent representation in Brussels, and there's some good news coming from there that this Thursday on the 25th, the Council of the EU under Slovenian presidency will most probably adopt the final compromise text of the Digital Services Act. DMA was approved last week. A great job indeed, I would say, for the presidency, as there were many opposing views, as you mentioned briefly also in your introduction, between the so-called maximalist and minimalist member states. In your report, you've stated that not all regulation is equally applicable and effective in different member states. Just your brief comment on the process. Slovenian presidency spent an enormous amount of time to bring together the two, I wouldn't say opposing, but differing blocks when it comes to certain solutions in the Digital Services Act. And now finally, we got a good compromise as far as the information from Brussels is concerned. What can we expect in the next stages? I mean, we're going to have the trialogues. There's still a long way to go. Maybe your brief comment on that we were able, at least within half a year, to bring together the maximalist and the minimalist views, Germany and France on one side, and mostly CE and Scandinavian countries on the other. Just very briefly, Fredrik.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, this is going to be sort of a process which is going to spill over to the next year. We're going to have a couple of votes in the European Parliament in the coming weeks. And then you will have to go into sort of a conciliation phase between the Council and the Parliament on these issues. And it may be that that's going to throw up a couple of surprises. I mean, who knows? But there is a strong push coming from not just Slovenia, but also from now, especially France, that they want to finish this as soon as possible to avoid it lingering on later in the spring, when France is, well, it has the presidency of the EU, but it's also going into its own national election. It doesn't want this to, or doesn't want to have anything hanging over them from the EU agenda. So it's going to be sort of a process that runs for a couple of months now. But I don't know, but I mean, I'll look, I don't follow sort of the conversations in the Council or the Parliament from a day-to-day basis, so I don't know. But my general impression, talking to a lot of governments on these issues, is that they have all struggled to try to figure out, what does this imply for me? And I don't really sort of, I think I've never come across any representative of government that had a very clear understanding of so if we introduce DMA, what will the consequence be on my economy? What do I need to prepare for in order to avoid that the DMA itself is going to have negative effects on the economy? So right. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, change or not do DMA. It may be sort of that you need to change something else domestically in order to avoid that a new regulation is going to have a negative effect on you.
Fredrik, thank you so much for this comment. I'm afraid that also when we talk with business representatives in Slovenia, in the CE region, in EU globally, generally, there's a lot of a big lack of understanding, I would also say, on what actually DSA, DMA, e-privacy, AI, digital governance, all sorts of regulations that are coming on the table now actually are bringing to day-to-day life of those businesses. And this is where I'm going to touch to Alina, to the question for Alina. Alina, we've heard a very comprehensive introduction from Fredrik on the legislation coming, the impact it has on different member states, but of course it has mostly impact on local digital players. You come from a global, a multinational digital company corporation, but you also, of course, observe local digital players. You work with them on a daily basis. What is your opinion on how the regulations we are talking about will impact local digital players? Alina, please.
Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me here today. I think you're totally right to raise this question, because a lot of people, when they think of AI or DSA, DMA, they think this will impact the big players, and it's going to be Amazon and Google and Facebook, and they'll find a way to comply with this, even if it's burdensome, even if it's not perfect. They'll be able to manage it. And I do think that's something that we've been trying to do in our conversations with stakeholders, is to explain that you aren't regulating a few companies, you're regulating the whole ecosystem. And you're not just regulating the big platforms, but everyone who is building a business on these platforms. So we have to make sure that the impact on the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, the traders that use marketplaces, the small advertisers that use targeting, personalized targeting to find a business, and the users, of course, the users of these products are all going to be impacted. Because what the DSA and the DMA, these are the areas that I work closest on, will do is it will actually dictate what kind of services and what kind of products will be available to consumers. So one of the things that we've been saying, and I think that it's been great to see that the Slovenians have done such a good job of, is the importance of balancing the innovation, the support of innovation, and the increase of competitiveness in the market, with the opportunity to protect users and protect small businesses who are trying to compete in Europe. And I think I can just give you a few examples of where this balance is important. For example, on the DSA, we're seeing a focus on product integration. Big players should not give undue advantage to their own services to the disadvantage of other players, for example. And we agree, there is an important part of the of competition law. However, we need to remember 30% of SMEs in Europe don't have websites, right? They rely on to be found on things like Google Maps. When you go on Google Maps, you search for your local flower shop, you'll see where it is, what time it is open, and you'll see the reviews from other users. If you are unable, if there's a ban on integrating that data from Maps onto search, then when people come to search, they'll only see 10 links with zero information about where that business is. You're making it harder for users to find local businesses. So it's important not just to think about the impact on intermediaries, but the impact on the user and the quality of the service that they receive, and that business user who is relying on the platforms to reach its audience. Another DMA example is this kind of ban on data processing across products. Because we want to encourage even smaller players that don't have a lot of data to be able to grow. And this is an important bit, right? There are 12 unicorns in CE right now. We want more of them, right? We want to encourage that kind of growth. But you have to understand that even these unicorns, they have different products, and they might rely on data sharing to keep their users safe. One example that we have is GPay. It's a payment process from Google where you put in your card details and you can pay with your phone, right? Really nice and easy. But what we do is we scan a lot of that cards data to make sure that we stop fraudulent transactions. And then we share that data about fighting fraud and scam with our browsers so that those fraudulent transactions can't happen on Chrome either. So this is where we need to make sure that while it is important for these rules to keep up with the technology, make sure that we pass these laws quickly and they're current, we need to find the right balance, and we need to ensure that we understand the impact that they have on the day-to-day service that users and businesses rely on.
Thank you,
I'm
Lina.
going to pause there.
Thank you very much. You touched on sharing of data. There's another very big topic, which is maybe not directly related to what we're talking now, but it's worth mentioning. It's the problem of data transfers. And I mean, that's another example where a regulation, a well-intended regulation, can bring extreme burdens to day-to-day, not only economy life or business life, but also to just everyday digital life in digital societies in the European Union and United States. We know this problem is being tackled by the Biden and by the European Commission, Biden administration and Commission. We're all hoping for a result which will be in accordance with GDPR and all the standards laid down in that global regulatory attempt of European Union to regulate privacy, which we have all been adapting to over the last 2 or 3 years. But at the end of the day, I can tell you that a lot of Slovenian companies are in a huge position of uncertainty right now, and it goes all over European Union, whether they will be still able to use cloud services and other services of United States companies. And as Frederick mentioned, Slovenia has an above average percentage of use of cloud services because we have 70% of our economy are SMEs, which largely are dependent on solutions of larger players, global players. So this is another topic that must be resolved. It's not only a legal, it's also a political issue. But maybe just a very brief comment on that, that we can see on a day-to-day level how actually it affects our lives. A simple thing, maybe a simple thing like the question of data transfers. Alina, please, just a very brief comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think you've touched on the key issue here. Data transfers are just part of our life. Whether you're making an order from an e-commerce website from a different country, and they simply need to send that data to your seller, which might be in the US, or they might be in the UK, right? We need to look at Brexit as well and what partnership we have, because the UK wants to change their own rules, and there's a question there about the data transfer agreement between the UK and EU. So all of these affect your ability to buy easily, to export as well, to find your audience. Let's say you're a small business, you want to sell your services in the US, and you want to find these, you want to target women in their 40s who are interested in shoes or purses or, I don't know, recruiting services. You need to make sure that you share that data with a provider of an advertising solution, for example, and they are able to transfer you the results of your targeting campaign. So those are just simple examples of using intermediaries to do everyday business and to use products as a user as well.
Alina, thank you so very much. Till let's go a bit local now, or more local. Let's go to Slovenia in the CE region. First of all, Till, maybe your comment on what we heard, and we can observe that everywhere also on the daily basis, is, are we actually really aware within the public administration, and I'm going to ask Igor also later on about the business sector, of the importance of the changes that are coming through this enormous legislative package of digital regulation. Your comment on that is coming from the public administration in Slovenia, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the way we can take advantage of what's actually happening right now in the CE region in Slovenia. Till, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Jaka, for giving me the floor. Let me just start by congratulating Center for European Perspective and the European Center for International Political Economy for organizing this highly topical webinar. It's a great honor to be here. And I very much enjoyed, and I very much welcome the survey that just at least some of the key findings that we heard, especially due to its systematic approach to, let's say, critical assessing the positive and the negative effects of the proposed regulations. Nevertheless, regulatory impact analysis is conditio sine qua non of good regulation, and is also at the heart of the so-called better regulation EU policy. So I believe that such survey can underpin the capacity of governments to ensure the regulations are efficient and effective in a changing and, let's say, complex world. As to your question, Jaka, well, maybe a brief comment, first of all, on the Slovenia agenda on the digital transformation, because digitalization of Slovenia gained a new momentum this year. In April, as you probably all panelists already know, Slovenian government established National Strategic Council for Digitalization. They have drafted 40 measures that will accelerate the digital transformation of government services, healthcare, education, and society at large. And in August, a government office for digitalization has been established. So we are operational above 100 days, and we did make some progress in coordinating and delivering some of the measures. For instance, from April 2022 onwards, all public administration documents shall be issued and signed in the electronic form by default. We have signed the tripartite contract of the pilot project for automatic subtitling of the TV programs for deaf and hard of hearing persons, which is based on the technology for automatic speech recognition of the Slovenian language. And of course, there are many other measures covering public administration and digital society, economy, business environment, new technologies, education, healthcare, digital diplomacy, and so on and so forth. As to the impact of the DSA, DMA, AI, well, in this case, Slovenia has sort of two-folded role, because firstly, as a member state, and secondly, as a country holding presidency of the EU. And of course, we support the DSA, DMA, and AI, sound regulation of the digital services, digital markets, and AI is actually necessary to protect citizens, to level the playing field, and at the same time to enable innovations and growth. We believe that DSA, DMA, AI contribute to the inclusive, sustainable, human-centric digital transformation, and they do provide democratic model of digital governance. However, as the member states holding the EU presidency, we must and we do act as an honest and neutral broker in supporting and driving forward the Council's work on EU legislation. And every effort is made that DMA and DSA will receive a wide support in the Competitiveness Council this Thursday, as you mentioned. Jaka, yes, I can only confirm what you have said. So we are optimistic that we are going to achieve the so-called general approach for both legislative act proposals. As to the AI Act, much progress has been done. The discussions continue, and the next Council for Transport, Telecommunication and Energy deliberating on AI Act is scheduled for 3rd of December, and progress report shall be presented then.
Till, thank you so very much, and absolutely, again, congratulations to the hardworking team at the permanent representation in Brussels and at the ministries of public administration. Your office and other ministries in Slovenia. It's been really a tough 5 months and 1 month to go. Till, just touching briefly, we cannot comment on the process as a honest broker and the country holding presidency. But if I go back to the Blitz Strategic Forum, Till, we had in September in Slovenia, we put some emphasis on the CEE region there, as well as the importance of connecting with similarly, I would say, countries that are in a similar position when it comes, I'm going to only talk about digital agendas now and digital regulation. It seems like also that our work in the presidency was also powered a little bit by being able to actually understand the positions of the CEE region and of other big member states on the other side of the European Union. Briefly, your comment on the importance of understanding and combining and collaboration of similar countries when it comes to size, digital economy, and the impact of digital regulation. For example, we're talking about the CEE region today. Till, your brief comment on that, please.
Yes, I absolutely agree that cooperation is absolutely necessary, since digitalization knows no border. In this regard, I would like to mention that on 13th of November, together with Atlantic Council, we are organizing the 3Cs initiative, Ministerial Conference on Digital Transformation. And yes, there is much common in the region, and I really look forward to further read the study that has been presented today.
Right.
I already made some notes to pass them to the colleagues in the office.
Phil, thank you so very much. Frederick raised his hand. Frederick, please, you have a comment maybe or a question regarding what we heard from other panelists?
Just a very quick one. It was actually when you were talking to Alina previously, and you went into the issue about data transfers, and Jaka, you talked about the collapse of the privacy shield between United States and Europe. My point was that this is a very, very typical and good example of what happens to different types of firms when you have different type of regulatory restrictions coming in. So what happened here was basically that you cannot transfer data inside the privacy shield as you could do before. That doesn't mean that you cannot transfer data between United States and Europe. It is that you need to use other legal strategies for it. So for instance, standard contractual clauses is one of them. Now we have enough time and we have enough experience what have happened to data transfers between Europe and America and Europe after the collapse of the privacy shield. And it's a very, very strong consequence, which is that large firms have the legal and financial resources to do standard contractual clauses. Small firms don't, so they don't transfer any data anymore. And there's a knock-on effect coming on small firms when you have changes of regulations like that. So I thought it was a very, very good example, and it connects with other type of effects that we can see coming from DSA, DMA, and the AI regulation as well, which is that small firms are going to be disproportionately affected by them.
Precisely, Frederick, and that's why I mentioned it. I think it really, complements what you've been talking about on DSA and DMA, and I cannot agree more on what you said. SCCs, or standard contractual clauses, are an instrument under the GDPR, and they require an enormous amount of legal knowledge to actually work. And even if they're implied and executed in the right way, that still does not mean that all the obligations are fulfilled entirely under the GDPR. And look, Frederick and everybody else, GDPR was a great step toward not only European, but I would say global approach towards privacy. But again, on a day-to-day level, I can see that larger enterprises and larger organizations have a much easier way of fulfilling all the criteria, because GDPR itself is a very complex legal act. So will be the DSA, so will be the DMA, so will be the e-privacy. And don't forget, e-privacy will be lex specialis, as we lawyers say, a special act under the GDPR. And it will, what we're always saying here in Slovenia is 70% of our businesses and exports are based on SMEs, and SMEs do not have the legal and human resource capacities to be overburdened with regulation. That's why it's so important that we strive for everything that was mentioned today, also in transparent and applicable legislation when it comes to different countries, also in different jurisdictions within the EU. Frederick, thank you so much for your comment. Igor, last but not least, I'll touch on the business side now. We've heard about the legal framework in the digital future of the European Union. You and I have been talking about it in many seminars, roundtables, and conferences in the last year or two. But I always ask you, Igor, what are the measures, or which steps do you think the businesses, and you can focus on Slovenian type of economy, which is largely based on SMEs, do we need the most to actually gain momentum in what President of the Commission, von der Leyen, said should be the Europe's digital decade? What do you see from the business side as the most important measures and approach that you would recommend to the regulators, as, for example, in the capacity of Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce? Igor, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jaka. I was listening to all of you, and focus was on the regulating this digital environment and moving it to the right direction in the future. I think we have to be very, clear that it's not only regulation that's making us good and better in the future. It's very important that we build also the other stuff. For example, competencies. We have to build on human capital, and the people are in Europe don't want to change. They don't trust everything, also because the regulation is, targeting their minds don't trust, be aware, and so on. And this trust is going lower, and they don't want to change. They don't want to adapt very quickly because also we have the older population. But at the same time, the companies need these new people who would understand the digitalization, who would like to change something, who would like to go forward, who would like to use all these digital tools and so on. But at the same time, smartly do that. Not just use it, but do it smartly and do it. Don't spend too much money to go to digitalization, but spend right enough and understand that in investment in digitalization is also some kind of added value. If you buy a machine, there you know how to calculate how much money will you earn with the machine. You have to do the similar way for the digitalization. So in the countries like C region, we are very, we sell a lot of stuff to Germany, to France, to other big countries and the big industries. So we are all the time following their example. But at the same time, we have to do it differently. They're big. They have big IT teams in the companies. We, for example, in Slovenia, average company is 20 to 50 people. So you have one guy who have to understand digitalization from the regulation, from the competencies, from the environment side. And we have some kind of multi-culti machines that we have to do that. So I think in Slovenia and also all the other countries, we have, at the same time, we have to build some kind of ecosystem of local IT providers who would use the global technology and platforms, but at the same time, there's some kind of defense of the users, of the small companies, of the people, so they don't feel that they have to adapt to every regulation, they have to read every law, they do have to understand every cybersecurity stuff and so on. You have to have some kind of line of defense. And I think these are local IT providers, service providers, cloud providers, and this kind of environment has to be established. And I think it's very important, for example, in Slovenia, that we have now the Office of Digital Transformation. When we talk about the user experience, how to build this kind of environment, ecosystem, how to bring together the government, the IT providers, the telecoms, the global players, and also all the ministries. So you don't look at the pillars, you don't look at the pillars of regulation, but you look at the whole package and what this kind of package can be beneficial for the SMEs. And if the SMEs trust the digitalization, they will also invest. Mm-hmm. They will spend money and they will have an additional added value from that. And a lot of these documents was written also by McKinsey, for example, 2 years ago. How much money can we get? How much BDP can be raised if, for example, these crucial steps should be made in the way of digitalization of SMEs and of the humans in Slovenia, for example.
Thank you very much. And one of the goals of our digital coalition is also to bring different stakeholders together for the public sector, economy, local municipalities, research and development, science, etc. And I think that's one of the a good ways to go forward, because all the stakeholders must cooperate when we talk about digital regulation and digital environment in general. Igor, briefly, we've heard it a few times today, and you mentioned it also now with investments. Let's turn investment into innovation. There's always a fragile balance between innovation and regulation. Over-regulation always lowers innovation. And the business view on innovation and investments, as you mentioned, is clear, if I understood you correctly, clear, transparent, and applicable regulation. What is your message to the regulators in Slovenia, in European Union, when it comes to this fragile balance between innovation and regulation? The last thing we want to see in European Union and Slovenia is that our companies, which have been happening also in the past in several sectors, move their headquarters or their research facilities to jurisdictions which are not burdening their innovation over the I would say the normal or the standard level. So Igor, very briefly in a few sentences, innovation, regulation, investment, business view.
This is the question for 1 million euros. If there's an answer, simple answer, everybody will practice that. But I think it's very important that the business and also the research and development environment understands the regulation, and at the same time we have to have some kind of certainty what will be the impact. So if we understand correctly what can we do and what we cannot do, it's a simple way to use it in the right direction, and at the same time to research on the field that you're allowed to do it. Also on the data side. I think the most important thing is the regulators also on the national level, not only on the European level, should check what will be the impact, what is the concrete result of this kind of regulation, and what is expected from the research and development, the business environment. Okay. I think we don't have this kind of clear picture in these times, also because so many regulations changing.
All right, Igor, thank you so very much. Just a note to all of you who are listening, please write your questions in the chat. We'll not be able to enter you into the discussion, but if you write them in the chat, we'll be very happy to review them and ask our panelists. And we have a question already by Wolfgang. How do you see, and I think, Frederick, I can ask you this question, how do you see the relationship between political and economic regulation on one side and technical standardization and its certification on the other side? Frederick, please.
Thank you, and thanks also to Wolfgang for the question. It's actually a very, very good question, and it's a very important one. Sort of generally, when we sort of take a long view on the IT sector, information technology, mostly, of course, on the hardware side, but to some extent on the software side as well, we've, of course, seen there has been a bottom-up development over a long time where we've had a lot of work being done by, for instance, the International Telecommunications Union, and we've had other standardization bodies, mostly private standardization bodies, that have been working to draw up the technical standards that are going to apply for, you know, everything from sort of the VHS recorder you had in the 1980s until sort of 5G and talking about 6G today. Most of that has been codified by governments into a regulatory context as well, in order to make sure that we can facilitate a lot of integration across borders and to avoid that we have a fractioners type of market where, you know, we have one 5G standard in one country and another standard in another country, which basically means that we're not going to draw the benefits from it in the past. We haven't seen a similar type of development in the areas of standards for the digital economy when you step from hardware to software. We've seen it in some. Here there has been a lot more impulses coming from government that they want to set the tone for what standardization in technical bodies also going to end up with at some point later. And I think this is a bit unfortunate because you are taking away some of the great benefits also from a user side and from an externalization side when you have so many differences across the world as you have right now in the regulatory landscape. So if we look at, you know, GDPR or data processing requirements, if we look at security, cybersecurity aspects, if we look, for instance, at data localization measures and how we deal with that internationally, we have a very, very fragmented picture globally right now, which is leading to that we're not gaining as much as we could do from digitalization. All the investments that we make in network capacity and building up human capital for the digital sector, we don't get as much benefits from it because we can't use sort of the broad internationalization methods that we otherwise would use. Let me also make sort of a segue here to one of the points.
Frederick, very briefly, if you can maybe add.
Yeah, sure. On innovation and regulation. And what I think Europe needs to pay attention to is to avoid that Europe is going to be the odd man out in the world when it comes to regulation, because the things we're talking about here, frontier type of innovation, new innovations, there can be a very strong impact on the willingness to invest in Europe compared to investing in South Korea, in Singapore, in Japan, in Australia, in Brazil, or in the United States, if Europe has a different type of regulations with high restrictiveness. Just one example. On AI, our human capital in Europe is actually pretty good when it comes to AI. Our sort of AI human capital intensity is higher than in America if you look at the number of scholars in business and universities that work on AI. However, we have much smaller business investments into AI. The private equity investments that go into AI in Europe is a small fraction of what happens in America or in China or other countries, partly because the regulatory side is different in Europe. It's much more difficult to commercialize these new innovations, and therefore all these investments go to other parts of the world instead.
Thank you, Fredrik, so very much. Mr. Rosland, Till, there's a question for you, and then Igor, I'm going to go to you. You raised your hand. Thank you so much. Till, what impact of DMA, DSA, AI regulations do you see on the thriving startup sector in Slovenia? That is a comparative advantage we have, a very thriving startup sector here. The question from Eva is, are they better off than average SMEs due to their digital skills in general? Very briefly, if you can comment on that, Till, please.
Okay, I just had to unmute myself. Yes, thank you for this question. Well, I think that absolutely that regulatory impact analysis is necessary. In Slovenia, as have already been mentioned, vast majority of the companies are SMEs, and the regulatory burden that will affect them is definitely a threat. So I think that it is very important that investments are, let's say, aligned with some policy goals that needs to be known in advance. Maybe it is important also to know when DSA, DMA, and AI will come into force. So what is the timeline? And I think it's around 3 to 6 months after the adoption and publication in the OJ, in the official journal.
There's still time to adapt. If I may add something to you, Till, maybe did you want to comment something more, Till, so I don't break you? No.
Well, maybe there is just a link with the DESI index, because this is sort of interlinked with that topic. And on the DESI index, Slovenia for the first time has been above the EU average. We ranked 13.
From 16,
from 16 to 13, and in 3 categories, so human capital, connectivity, integration of digital technology, Slovenia is above the EU average, whereas in 2 categories, digital public services and research and development in ICT, we are below. So so one of the let's say topics that we really must focus on is also digital public services for citizens and for businesses must be improved. And also we did identify that research and development expenditure by business enterprises is quite low in Slovenia as well.
Thank you so much. Eva, if I may also add the answer to your question is startups and other SMEs will benefit comparably more from the legislation that's coming only if they will know it well. And there is time to prepare, and there is time to, adapt business models. And believe me, Eva, and all the other startups, business models will have to adapt to new regulatory circumstances and realities in the European Union, just as they did have to adapt to that when GDPR was adopted on the 25th of May, 2018. So there is time, and I would encourage, and the Chamber of Commerce is encouraging all SMEs and other businesses in Slovenia, and it goes into the CE region as well, to really follow these really, really important legislative initiatives and packages being prepared and adopted in Brussels. Igor, I give you a minute. You raise your hand, and because then we have conclusive questions for all the panelists. We need to touch on another topic. Do you still want to add something, Igor?
Yeah, please. I have some comment on both questions. So we have to understand that in Slovenia and sea region, IT community is using our countries for some kind of sandboxes. So we are trying to use this our environment, small markets of 2 million people, of 100,000 enterprises, and then if you want to go out, I think the impact of this new regulation, it's not so big on their sandboxes. It's very important that the governments are supporting this new digital environment. So also in our AI regulation and strategy in Slovenia, government will offer the data to use it in some kind of sandbox purposes. So I think the governments are moving to cooperate with SMEs and in ICT SMEs, and I think this is good. But if you want to go outside our countries, we have to have a single digital market of Europe. If you want to have to go to every country, to every market separately, because everybody has this own regulation and different standards, different economy and political standards, and also technical standards, it's a problem. So we support this kind of standardization as in invoicing, as other customs procedures, for example, and so on. So we want to support this kind of activities of EU, and we want to have this kind of standards that the companies can work better, can cooperate digitally better, and also the ICT sector can have better solutions to go worldwide. So this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. We're coming to the last round of questions. And I'm going to wrap this question into one and then two sub-questions, which I will kindly ask you to comment on. There's a lot, and this is also a question for Frederick and for Till. How can we assure digital or strategic sovereignty and still remain competitive in the global digital arena? You come from a global company, you know what it means to be competitive, innovative in the global digital arena, but we have also on European Union side, a desire, a program, a will of so-called digital sovereignty, and how can those two be balanced in your views? And if they're not balanced, Alina, would that reduce digital investments into the local economy? Would that have consequences for consumers and businesses? For example, if technology openness would be restricted in the EU? Alina, please, your conclusive thoughts on those rather complex one and two sub-questions, please.
Just because we're running out of time, I'm going to keep it very short. I think it's extremely important to make sure that as we look at to encourage the pan-European business sector to grow and digitize, and people to get the skills to be able to support this huge initiative, both in the CE but across Europe, it is important to make sure that a global perspective remains. You get the right investors in Europe. Big investors bring their own supply chains, their own knowledge. They train people, right? We employ people in Europe. We train millions of Europeans. So making sure that Europe is open for business, open to investors is extremely important. And practically how you can do that, if I may. We are very grateful and we appreciate all the efforts that the Slovenian presidency of the Council has done in the last 4 or 5 months to bring the DSA DMA and move it forward and close to them being adopted by the Council. However, this is not the end of legislation. We are still going through trialogues, and it is important that we have the right conversations and still solve for some issues that are still out there, on making sure that there is regulatory dialogue and that there are safeguards under the DMA to ensure that innovation continues. On the DSA, there are important questions out there about, the incentives we give to marketplaces. It's not only about can the small businesses comply with the new regulatory burden, but it's also about what incentives do you give to big businesses to work with small businesses. If you make marketplaces liable for products of third-party sellers, you incentivize them to only do business with the big players that don't bring them any risk. Why would I open my platform to a small trader that I can't really do any verification of? So a focus on transparency and a focus on a balanced legislative approach with the right amount of dialogue between countries is extremely important, and countries and the technology providers is extremely important.
Alina, thank you so very much for your words. We're really coming to the end of our really interesting discussion. But before we do so, Frederick and Till, your comment on what I asked Alina, digital sovereignty on one side, competitiveness in the global arena on the other side, and additional question for you two guys, is the EU's ambition to be the global digital regulator, GDPR, DSA, DMA, privacy, AI, DGA, so on and so forth, the right way to go? Your brief final comments on those two questions, and I'll start with you, Frederick, please.
So let me end with 3 comments. I'm afraid they're not going to respond to all your questions, Jaka, but that would take a longer time. My first comment is basically a recommendation to policymakers, which is that when you regulate, make sure that you have clear regulations that are understandable for every stakeholder that will be affected by them. In this case, the DMA is a very poor example. I know a lot of companies that simply don't understand what this means for them. I know asking regulators, they can't give an explanation to what will be the practical implications for company X, Y, and Z when you will start to apply these regulations to them. So coming, for instance, to the example that we heard in the beginning, can you use data from Google Maps into Google search? That's a pretty good question to ask. You should ask them to regulator and see what they say. They don't know. And if that's the case, well, then I think we are in the territory of making regulations that will confuse investors and other companies that want to make use of them. So if that's the case, it becomes even more important that you have feedback loops in these regulations, that you ensure that if things go in a direction which is simply not in tune with the objective of the regulation, you need to course correct, you need to change regulation. So I think it's incredibly important now that, now that we are moving with these regulations, that we have huge opportunities for feedback loops from industry, from users, from SMEs and others, that they can sort of feed into regulators what needs to change and what needs to happen to avoid that the regulation itself is going to be in contradictions with the objective itself. My second point is that each and every country now need to look at what other type of strategies they need to use in order to move extremely fast on building up your own endowments and capacity to digitalize faster than we're doing right now. Europe's problem compared to the rest of the world is that we're too slow in our digitalization, not that we are too fast, we're too slow. The rest of the world is racing ahead with investments in R&D, in capacities, in networks, and in building up the entrepreneurial ecology that is going to define so much of the 21st century and so much of business in 21st century. Europe is behind on this curve, and now we really need to accelerate because, and this leads me to my third point, which is that when you look at big industrial shifts like the one we're going through right now, you can rest assured that speed is of essence, time is of essence, that if we are waiting even longer, if we are delaying necessary changes that needs to happen for our economies to be at the frontier of innovation and technological change, we are not going to be able to catch up on those at the top in the future. There will always be sort of opportunities for catch-up processes, but if you take, for instance, the introduction of electricity 150 years ago when we started to do that, and especially with the expansion in the early 1900s, the competitiveness patterns that generated because some regions move faster than others, they are still there. We can see it still in our industry structures, and it's manifesting itself, particularly in our human capital, how good we are at building up human capital and exploit our human capital for commercial purposes. So time is really of essence.
Frederick, thank you so very much for that. Till, I will ask you now, and I'll start where Frederick ended. Time is of essence. regulation and legislation till always lacks or follows behind innovation. It's always been like this. When there is a new regulation or law in the digital or technology sector, it's already outdated. That's an old saying among us lawyers. So speed is of essence, and your conclusive words for Slovenian society, economy, everybody who's listening to us regarding the way we're going to treat regulation. I think a lot of what we heard also from Frederick is embodied in the strategy and the vision of your Office for Digital Transformation and the Strategic Council, which was established a few months earlier. So till your conclusive words from the public administration of Slovenia on what you just heard from Alina and from Igor before, and now from Frederick, and we will conclude our roundtable with your conclusive words. Till, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Jaka. Well, maybe I would like to go just a bit out of the box and mention something else that I believe is very important for digital sovereignty. That is if I understood you, the key point actually of this last round of the question. And I would like to highlight that until the end of our presidency, we are strengthening our focus on the issue of the semiconductors. I think this is a very important topic for digital sovereignty, because we are really aware of the fact that semiconductors are at the core of the digitalization and global technological race, and the world is short of semiconductors. Therefore, United States and EU are strongly committed to secure geostrategic interests by addressing this issue in America by American and in EU by EU Chips Act. With the objective to increase resilience of supply chain and, of course, the sovereignty. And in Slovenia, we gathered experts to think about the solutions and how we could contribute. And we came up with an idea that Minister Andrijanic shared with the Commissioner Breton and Executive President Jes Vestager, and will soon be shared with them in the paper, with the hope to contribute to the EU Chips Act scheduled for the second quarter of 2022 European Commission work plan. So I think this is one also very important issue as regards digital sovereignty.
Okay, thank you so much, Till. This is technological digital sovereignty, and then we're talking about the regulatory one, which is also highly on the agenda in the European Union. And just to your conclusive words on the balance between digital sovereignty and competitiveness on the global market, and please, through the eyes of Slovenia and CE region, where our economic position, as we've heard many times today, due to the size of our companies, their agility, their interconnection on the global stage is very important. We'd really like to hear your, maybe comforting or positive or optimistic words that your office and the Strategic Council will continue with the projects which have so much been, I would say, embodied also in what we've heard from Alina and Frederick and Igor and others in today's and past conferences we had. So, Till, just a few more sentences to conclude. The stage is yours again, please.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, the digitalization, of course, is the name of the game, and Europe has the historic opportunity not only to become the regulatory leader in this arena, but also to establish itself as the winner of the global digital technology race. And digital transition and ethical use and development of AI are among top priorities of the Slovenian presidencies, and of course also of the Government Office for the Digital Transformation. So yes, I'm pretty sure that our future is bright.
Optimistic, Till, and one thing is that we're very active in Brussels and in drafting of EU legislation, but the next stage, once it's drafted and adopted, it must also be implemented, and it must be implemented in a way that doesn't burden the society or the businesses. And I think a lot of work in Slovenia when it comes to implementation of EU regulations and legislation still needs to be upgraded, but that's my personal opinion, obviously. Would Frederick or Alina or anybody else want to have any conclusive sentence, because we have really come to the end of our panel. We're 10 minutes over. Igor, really one sentence, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jaka. I would just like to say that if you look at the business environment, we would like to have a user-friendly, user-centric environment. So we would like not to talk about regulation. We would like to set the standards, how to do business, how to open the borders, how to be transparent and so on. So, and we would like to have also on EU level and national level some kind of programs how to implement that, because also the national bodies have a problem how to bring everything from EU to the national level. So not regulation for us, for end user, but standardization and the way how to implement it through the cases, through the good practices, so it don't hurt later on.
Igor, thank you so very much for that. I think we are really now at the very end of our really interesting conversation. Alina, Frederick, Till, Igor, thank you very, very much for being with us at this really interesting debate. I really hope to see you again on a similar stage soon. I wish you all the best with your work. And thank you so much. And thank you also to all the participants and of course to the organizers of today's conference. Thank you. Have a great remaining week and hope to see you all soon. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.